one point of administrative business. You'll see on the BSpace that I've posted a notice of a talk in 223 at Moses Hall on Thursday between 4 and 6 p.m. of the British ambassador to the US, whose name is escaping me, Sir somebody, of course, coming to talk about Britain, America, and Asia. I mean, just the title, and the new Pacific Century or something. Very smart title that puts Britain in the same category as both America and of Asia. But I urge you to attend. I'm sure that it will be an interesting talk, and I'm sure it will be of direct use and relevance to the later part of this class, and I'll remind you again on Thursday. There's also likely to be things to drink and to eat. Okay, so you'll remember that I spectacularly miscalculated my lectures last week and thought I was going to be giving this lecture on Thursday and not the one on popular culture. So I think I began last week saying this is the week where we're going to be really moving into a sort of slightly different age, the sort of late Victorian period where everything begins to go slightly to pot. And that's this week, okay? So we are clearly in the two lectures of this week transitioning into a discussion of the gradual, very, very gradual move away from, if you like, the golden age of optimism that had characterized the sort of mid-Victorian period, and this sort of firm belief in progress that came out of liberal political economy, wonderfully illustrated in this slide of the economic progress and the march of civility and so forth. What I'm going to talk about today is a new air of uncertainty that began to surround those old beliefs in the forward march of progress. And it happens in a number of ways. First of all, there's a recognition that Britain's economic expansion and its imperial expansion is now occurring in an increasingly global stage, occurring on an increasingly global stage. In many ways, this period from the 1870s on represents, I think, the first age of globalization. Now, historians talk about globalization going back to, you know, to the mist of time. But I'm going to suggest to you today that this is a really important moment in which world economies become increasingly seen to be part of a world system. So the first thing is that Britain now has competitors on this global stage in a way in which it really hadn't done before. Second element is that the belief in the progress that would come by following liberal political economy, by following the tenets of liberal political economy, began to be increasingly undermined by an awareness of its social consequences at home. So on Thursday I'm going to be talking to you about the discovery of poverty, and today I'm going to be talking to you about cities as emblems both of the forward march of progress, but also as demonstrating some of its negative consequences. And the third part of this process of increasing uncertainty in the tenets of liberal political economy was the understanding that the market didn't necessarily always work efficiently and well. Okay? That is to say that a whole series of economic crises from the 1860s through to the 1870s and 1880s began to expose not only the increasingly globally connected nature of economic life, but to demonstrate that the market was subject to occasional systematic failure. And therefore, and this is the critical point, therefore, the increasing awareness of social problems like poverty, like urbanization, began to be seen as a consequence of the failure of the market, not a consequence of the failure of particular individuals to become this ideal liberal person that I've kept talking to you about. So in short, what I'm at again today is to say, look, there's the same old trend that I've been talking to you about for weeks now, that liberalism produces and is undermined by its own contradictions. Yeah, if we think about the Great Exhibition work and the celebration of free trade works in relationship to the production of poverty and of famine in the Irish context. That the expansion of political rights happens in the context of other people being denied the citizenship. And I gave you the classic case of women last week. Now we're talking about how it is that liberal political economy generates and is increasingly seen to generate a new set of social problems. Now, the first great moment of recognition that you're moving into this new global age was arguably the cotton famine in the 1860s. The cotton famine came as a consequence, basically, of the American Civil War and Britain's loss of the ability to take cotton from the South for its textile manufacturers. What happens then is that Britain increasingly turns to its empire to reproduce the loss of cotton from the American South. It starts setting up the production of the growth of cotton in Egypt and increases its production in India. And the cotton famine is also important, not just for being able to demonstrate how economic processes, the economic fate of Britain is increasingly connected to a broader economic system beyond itself. It also creates widespread unemployment in the textile mills of the Northwest. Okay? And this cotton famine, and the unemployment caused by the cotton famine, is arguably one of the first times that Britons begin to see that poverty and unemployment was not the fault of individuals, but they were caught up in processes that they could not control. Now, the cotton famine is then quickly followed by the Great Depression that began in 1873 and lasts through to the 1890s. Now, again, the Great Depression, this is the world's first Great Depression, and there's going to be a lot of uncanny parallels to what we're experiencing today. Great Depression was the first global economic crisis. It began, and here's the uncanny parallels will proliferate, it began as a European financial crisis, and with the collapse of the stock market and a whole series of bank failures in Vienna, and then spreading quickly to the United States. It led, as it is currently today, to a series of runs on different currencies, pressures on different currencies. And in the British context, which is going to be very important for today's lecture, it led to the collapse of agricultural commodity prices. And indeed to the fall of textiles, the price of textiles. One of the consequences of the Great Depression was unleashing a new era of protection, of economic protectionism by nation states, to try and protect governments trying to protect their national economies from this global crisis. And this introduction of widespread protection therefore had serious consequences for Britain, which remained wedded to the idea of free trade. It basically meant that British goods were going to be playing at a disadvantage in its export markets, which were becoming, as you'll see, increasingly important to the British economy. And the agricultural crisis is the trigger for widespread, the acceleration of urbanization in Britain in the last quarter of the 19th century. Okay? And that is why I'm going to be returning to a discussion of cities at the end of the lecture. Rebecca, you had a question. The cotton famine was the early 1860s, sort of 1862 to 1864. The Great Depression, all of these things are given slightly different dates by different people, but the conventional chronology for the Great Depression is 1873 to 1896. Right. So I'm now going to talk to you about this restructuring of Britain's economy in the context of these in the context of both its own domestic trends and in terms of the restructuring of the global economy. And I'm going to do it under these four headings. I'm going to talk about the so-called long road of industrialization, then talk about the effect of the Great Depression on the agricultural sector, then talk about the rise and rise and rise and rise of finance capitalism, of overseas investment, and finally Britain's dependence, increasing dependence on overseas trade. And I'm going to give you a government health warning at this point. You are going to spend the next, say, 30 minutes being inundated with a lot of facts and figures and statistics. Okay? I'll go slowly so that you get as much as you can. Feel free to ask me to pause or to go back over the figures if you miss something. Now, in many ways, Britain becomes an industrial nation only in the second half of the 19th century. Okay? Although Britain had been precocious in its experience of industrialization during the 18th and early 19th century, it had been sectorally, that process of industrialization had been sectorally very specific. That is to say, it had been concentrated primarily on textiles and eventually in iron, steel, and coal. Okay, the so-called mineral revolution. Historians now no longer consider the Industrial Revolution to be this short, sharp, and dramatic thing that went from 1760 up to 1830. So now the general consensus is that Britain has this long road to industrialization in